April 1945. The European continent has been bleeding for almost 6 years. Cities lie in cinders, from Coventry to Kharkov, and a generation of men is buried in soil from the Atlantic to the Volga. But on the banks of a wide, slow river in eastern Germany, the war is about to enter its final, most violent act. The river is the Oder. On its eastern bank stand more than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers. 60 kilometers to the west stands Berlin, the capital of the thousand-year Reich that has lasted 12. Inside a concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, an exhausted, trembling man still believes the war can be won. Adolf Hitler will turn 56 in 4 days. The Red Army first reached the Oder in late January 1945. By then, the Wehrmacht that had once stood at the gates of Moscow was a hollow army, bled white in Belarus, smashed at Bagration, dismembered in Romania, and bottled up in the ruins of East Prussia. Marshal Zhukov's spearheads could, in theory, have lunged for Berlin in February. They did not. The reasons were prosaic and brutal. Supply lines stretched 1,000 kilometers back to Soviet depots. Exposed flanks in Pomerania threatened a German counterstroke, and the spring thaw was turning the North German plain into a swamp of mud and meltwater. Soviet doctrine, hammered out in the catastrophes of 1941 and the triumphs of 1943, demanded overwhelming logistical preparation before a strategic offensive. Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky would not move until they were ready. But politics moved faster than logistics. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin watched the Western Allies cross the Rhine in March with growing unease. He did not believe the assurances of Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, who had cabled directly to him on March 28th, confirming that the main American thrust would aim south toward Leipzig and Dresden, and not toward Berlin. Stalin replied politely. He told Eisenhower that Berlin had lost its former strategic importance and that he would commit only secondary forces against it. It was a lie. As the historian Antony Beevor documents in his study Berlin, The Downfall 1945, the very next day Stalin summoned Zhukov and Konev to the Kremlin, unrolled the maps, and demanded an attack within 2 weeks, months ahead of the schedule his generals had drawn up. The race for Berlin, in Stalin's mind, had already begun. For the people inside the city, the question was no longer whether the war would end, but how. Allied bombers had already reduced 1/3 of Berlin's built-up area to rubble. According to records of the Berlin City Administration, cited in Earl Ziemke's Battle for Berlin, end of the Third Reich, more than 50,000 civilians had died in air raids. Some 2.7 million remained, most of them women, children, foreign forced laborers, and old men. The Nazi authorities made no serious effort to evacuate them. They were, in the regime's twisted final logic, ammunition. The Battle of Berlin had not yet begun, but its shadow already covered the city like a second sky. To take the German capital, the Red Army assembled the largest concentration of military force ever fielded for a single operation in human history. The numbers, drawn from the operational reports preserved in the Central Archive of the Russian Ministry of Defense and reproduced in Christopher Duffy's Red Storm on the Reich, are difficult to grasp even today. 2.5 million soldiers, 150,000 of them Polish, fighting under Soviet command but with Polish eagles on their helmets. More than 6,000 tanks and assault guns, from the workhorse T-34/85 to the heavy IS-2 Stalin tank, whose 122mm gun could blow the turret off a Tiger at 1,500 meters. 41,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers, enough to put one barrel every 4 meters along the entire front. 7,500 aircraft. Enough fuel for 30 days of continuous combat. Enough rations for 33. Enough shells for, in some sectors, 15 full days of unbroken bombardment. The plan was Stalin's, but the execution belonged to three of the greatest commanders of the Second World War. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the brutal, brilliant savior of Moscow and the conqueror of Stalingrad's German encirclement, was given the central role. His first Belarusian front would attack from the Kustrin bridgehead, smash through the German defensive belt on the Seelow Heights, and drive straight along the Autobahn into the heart of Berlin. Stalin clearly intended Zhukov to take the city. The honor and the casualties were his. To the south, Marshal Ivan Konev commanded the First Ukrainian Front. His orders were ambiguous. Officially, Konev was to cross the Oder River, destroy German forces in front of him, and push west to meet the Americans on the Elbe. But Stalin drew the boundary line between Konev's and Zhukov's fronts only as far as the town of Lubin, and then left it blank. As Konev himself later wrote in his memoirs, Year of Victory, this silence was not an oversight, it was an invitation. If Zhukov bogged down, Konev was free to swing his tank armies north and race for Berlin himself. The northern flank fell to Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, a man who had survived Stalin's purges, 3 years in the Gulag, and the loss of most of his teeth to NKVD interrogators. His second Belarusian front would attack across the lower Oder several days late to protect Zhukov's right flank from any German counterattack out of Pomerania. Facing this hurricane stood the broken remnants of two German army groups. Army Group Vistula, under the cold and capable Colonel General Gotthard Heinrichi, defended the central Oder front. To his south, parts of Army Group Center under Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, a fanatic so brutal his own troops nicknamed him Bloody Ferdinand, held the Neisse. Together, they could field perhaps 1 million men on paper. In reality, far fewer were combat effective. The Wehrmacht had been bled to the bone. Many divisions were divisions in name only. Kampfgruppen of clerks, Luftwaffe ground crews, naval cadets, and teenagers. The Volkssturm, the desperate militia of old men, and Hitler Youth boys, raised in late 1944, often had 1 rifle for every 3 men and 4 bullets each. Tony Letizier, in the Battle of Berlin, 1945, records a Volkssturm battalion sent to the Seelow front, whose average age was 62. Heinrichi, a defensive specialist who had held off the Soviets for years in central Russia, did what little he could. He built 3 defensive belts on the Seelow Heights west of the Oder. Trenches, anti-tank ditches, machine gun nests, and the high ground of the heights themselves, rising 80 meters above the flat Oderbruch. He gambled that he could bleed the Red Army white before the river of fire reached Berlin. It was the only gamble left. At 3 o'clock in the morning of April 16, 1945, the Eastern Front fell silent. It was the silence before something the men on both sides would remember for the rest of their lives. Then, at 3 o'clock, Berlin time, every Soviet gun from the Baltic forests to the Sudeten mountains opened fire at once. According to the official Soviet General Staff study compiled after the war and partially translated by David Glantz, more than 9,000 artillery pieces and Katyusha launchers fired without pause for 30 minutes along Zhukov's sector alone. 500,000 shells fell on the German first defensive line in the first half hour. The sky behind the Soviet positions glowed red. The earth, even 10 kilometers behind the front, shook hard enough to crack farmhouse walls. And then came the lights. Zhukov, hoping to terrify and blind the enemy, had positioned 143 anti-aircraft searchlights behind his infantry. As the barrage lifted, they switched on together, beams the width of a man's arm slicing across the Oderbruch. The intent was theatrical. The result was tragic. The beams, refracted by the smoke and dust of the bombardment, instead silhouetted the advancing Soviet infantry against a wall of light. German machine gunners in the second defensive line, who had survived the shelling by pulling back beyond its curtain, opened fire on perfectly visible targets. The Seelow Heights rise just 80 meters above the floodplain, but in April 1945, they may as well have been the Alps. The Oderbruch was waterlogged, churned to porridge by spring meltwater and the bombardment itself. T-34s and IS-2s sank to their hulls. Soviet engineers laid log roads under fire. Whole battalions of infantry, advancing without the tanks that should have led them, were caught in the open by German machine guns and the dreaded 88mm flak guns firing horizontally. Heinrici had been clever. He had pulled most of his troops out of the first defensive line during the night of April 15th, leaving only thin screening forces. The Soviet bombardment fell on largely empty trenches. When the Red Army infantry climbed out of their start lines and waded forward into the mud, the German main line of resistance was almost intact and waiting. By the end of the first day, Zhukov's assault was hours behind schedule. Furious, under direct telephone pressure from Stalin in Moscow, he made a decision that historians have argued about ever since. He ordered the tank armies, the 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies, supposed to exploit a breakthrough that had not happened, to plunge into the battle anyway. They crashed into the rear of their own infantry on roads turned to sucking mud. The traffic jams could be seen from German artillery observers on the heights. Soviet losses that night were appalling. Marshal Vasily Chuikov, the hero of Stalingrad, witnessed Zhukov's rage from a few meters away. In his memoir, The End of the Third Reich, he records that Zhukov shouted himself hoarse at his own corps commanders, accusing them of cowardice, and ordered renewed attacks against positions the Germans had not even abandoned. Sergeant Pavel Goglitzer, a T-34 driver-mechanic in the 65th Guards Tank Brigade, left an account preserved in Hermann Klar's collection of Soviet armored memoirs. A horrifying hit shook our tank. An enemy shell had hit the right side of the turret, but the German projectile only grazed the armor without managing to penetrate it. Loader Tkachenko was deafened. On the left, I noticed 2 Germans with Panzerfausts in a dugout. I turned the tank to the left, added speed, and hit the Germans with the treads. For 3 days, the Red Army hammered itself against the heights. The Germans, outnumbered 7-1 in some sectors, fought with the desperation of men who believed surrender meant death. On the morning of April 19th, the last German line cracked. The 9th Parachute Division, a unit of teenagers commanded by Luftwaffe officers, simply disintegrated. The road to Berlin was open. The cost is still debated. The most reliable estimates, based on the operational casualty returns held at the Russian Central Archive and analyzed by Russian historian Alexei Isaev, place Soviet dead and missing at the Seelow Heights at over 30,000, with German losses around 12,000. It was, mile for mile, one of the most expensive operations of the Red Army's entire war. But the lock on the door to Berlin was broken. 200 kilometers to the south, on the Oder River, a different story was unfolding. Marshal Ivan Konev had spent the night of April 15th preparing his own artillery barrage, shorter than Zhukov's, but more precisely targeted. He had also done something Zhukov had not. He had personally rehearsed his river crossings with engineer units for weeks. When Konev's guns opened fire on the morning of April 16th, The German defenders of the Nasse, overstretched units of Schörner's Army Group Center, with only 2 divisions in the first line over a 50-kilometer front, collapsed almost immediately. By midday, Konev had pontoon bridges across the river. By evening, his 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies were pouring through the gap. Within 48 hours, his tanks were on open ground, racing west. In the Kremlin, Stalin made his decision. According to the post-war memoirs of both Konev and Marshal Sergei Shtermenko, deputy chief of the General Staff, Stalin called Konev personally on the evening of April 17th and said only 9 words: "Turn your tank armies toward Berlin." The race was on. By April 20th, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, both Zhukov's and Konev's armored spearheads were sprinting through the forests south and east of Berlin. The German front had not collapsed. It had simply ceased to exist as a continuous line. Isolated Kampfgruppen fought, surrendered, fled, or were overrun, depending on the courage and exhaustion of the men in them. Soviet tank crews drove with the recklessness of men who could finally see the end of the war. Some units, according to Catherine Meridale's Ivan's War, advanced over 60 kilometers in a single day. In Berlin, the air war became artillery war. On the afternoon of April 21st, the first Soviet long-range guns came in range of the city center. A round, fired by a 152mm howitzer of the 79th Rifle Corps, fell in the Wilhelmplatz, a few hundred meters from the Reich Chancellery. From that hour, shelling never stopped. Inside the Führerbunker, the cracks in the regime widened into chasms. On the morning of April 20th, the Nazi leadership gathered to wish Hitler a happy birthday. The Bundesarchiv preserves the guest list. It includes Goebbels, Göring, Himmler, Dönitz, Speer, Bormann, Ribbentrop, and Generals Krebs and Burgdorf. Hitler appeared briefly above ground in the Chancellery Garden to decorate a row of Hitler Youth boys for destroying Soviet tanks with Panzerfausts. One photograph survives. It is the last known film of Adolf Hitler. He is 64 days from his own death and looks 20 years older than his actual age. That same evening, Göring requested permission to leave for Bavaria. Hitler waved him away. Himmler departed for the North German town of Hohenlohe. Speer flew to Hamburg. Ribbentrop simply disappeared into the suburbs. The journalist who watched the convoys of black staff cars streaming out of the dying capital called it the Fasanenflucht, the flight of the pheasants. Inside the bunker, Hitler now had General Krebs and a shrinking circle of true believers. The Nazi state, as a functioning entity, was emptying out of its own capital. On April 22nd, Hitler suffered what witnesses described as a complete nervous collapse. The senior surviving SS officer Hermann Fegelein, the bunker stenographer Gerhard Hergesell, and the secretary Traudl Junge all recorded versions of the scene. For the first time in front of his generals, Hitler admitted out loud that the war was lost. He screamed for hours. Then, in a sudden reversal, he announced a counteroffensive. General Wenck's 12th Army would attack from the southwest, General Steiner's SS battle group from the north, General Buss's 9th Army from the southeast. The 3 armies would meet at Berlin and crush the Russians. It was a fantasy. Steiner had almost no troops. Wenck's 12th Army was already turning west to try to surrender to the Americans. Buss's 9th Army was about to be encircled itself. But Hitler ordered the offensive anyway, then sent the order out by radio in plain German. Soviet intelligence intercepted it within hours. On April 24th, the steel jaws closed. Konev's forces met Zhukov southeast of Berlin, near the village of Bohnsdorf. The city was now surrounded. The same day, a separate Soviet pincer, cut off most of General Theodor Busse's Ninth Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army in the dense forests southeast of Berlin. The trapped force, somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 soldiers and an unknown number of civilians, became known to the Germans as the Halbe Pocket, after the small forest town at its center. What happened in that forest over the following 10 days was, even by the standards of the Eastern Front, a vision out of Hieronymus Bosch. The Halbe Pocket has no equivalent in any other theater of the Second World War. It was not a battle. It was a slow-motion massacre in a pine forest 20 kilometers wide. Inside the encirclement were the remnants of General Theodor Busse's Ninth Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, perhaps as many as 200,000 soldiers, depending on which post-war German staff study one believes. With them were tens of thousands of civilians, women, children, and old men from the villages of Brandenburg, who had fled westward ahead of the Red Army and now found themselves trapped between the lines. Hitler ordered Busse to march north and break the Soviet ring to relieve Berlin. Busse, in one of the few moments of moral clarity to come out of the final days of the Wehrmacht, ignored the order. Together with General Walter Wenck of the 12th Army to the west, he made a different plan. The two armies would not relieve Berlin. They would punch toward each other, link up, and run for the American lines on the Elbe. They would save as many soldiers as they could. The civilians of Berlin, and of the pocket itself, would have to fend for themselves. The breakout began on the night of April 25th. Soviet aircraft and artillery hammered the columns from the moment they moved. The few remaining German tanks led, with infantry behind, and civilians stumbling along the flanks and rear. The forest roads were narrow. The wounded were left behind. Catherine Meredale, drawing on Soviet veteran interviews and the records of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, describes Red Army gunners firing directly into the column at point-blank range with 28 ZIS-3 anti-tank guns for hours without pause. A German tank commander named Georg Diers survived the breakout. His account, preserved in the collection edited by historian Karl Fee, captures the horror without metaphor. Our breakout was in the direction of Nauen-Oranienburg. We traveled through towns, often under murderous Russian fire. Anyone wounded had to be left behind. Many of them begged for a hand grenade or a bullet in the head. We could only give out hand grenades as long as there were any left to help these boys. An ambulance truck driving ahead of me with 2 or 3 rows of stretchers was hit. The wounded clung to the sides, screaming. It was a terrible sight. On the night of April 28th, after 3 days of running fights through the forest, roughly 25,000 German soldiers and an unknown number of civilians broke through the overextended Soviet rear lines south of Berlin and reached Wenck's 12th Army. Tens of thousands more lay dead in the woods. The Soviet burial teams that arrived in the following weeks counted more than 30,000 German corpses in the forests around Halbe and Baruth alone. To this day, the Wehrmacht cemetery at Halbe, run by the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, holds more than 28,000 named graves. While the Halbe drama played out in the forests, on the broad open meadows of the River Elbe, a very different scene unfolded. On the afternoon of April 25, 1945, at the small town of Torgau, a 4-man patrol of the U.S. 69th Infantry Division, led by 2nd Lieutenant William Robertson, rode across a partially destroyed bridge and met a patrol of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division on the eastern bank. They shook hands. They exchanged cigarettes and chocolate. They photographed each other. The U.S. National Archives still hold those photographs. They are some of the most famous images of the war. The handshake at Torgau cut the Reich in half, north and south, and announced to the world that Nazi Germany had only days left. But the announcement was premature. Berlin, the wounded capital of the dying Reich, was not yet conquered. Inside the ring, the most savage fighting of the entire campaign had only just begun. No honest history of the Battle of Berlin can leave out what both armies did to the civilians and to each other in those final 2 weeks. The crimes were not incidental to the battle. They were woven into it. The Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Feldgendarmerie, the military police whose gorget badges earned them the nickname Kettenhunde or chain dogs, turned their guns inward in April 1945. According to research by the German historians Manfred Messerschmitt and Fritz Willner, published by the Bundesarchiv, more than 20,000 German soldiers were executed by their own side during the final months of the war, the vast majority of them in the last weeks. The crimes alleged ranged from desertion to defeatism, sometimes nothing more than telling a comrade the war was lost. Whole hanged corpses dangled from Berlin lampposts with cardboard signs around their necks reading, "I was a coward," or "I betrayed the Führer." SS units carried out a final wave of revenge killings against political prisoners. At Sachsenhausen concentration camp, just north of Berlin, the SS forced more than 33,000 prisoners onto death marches in late April with orders, according to documents recovered after the war by the Camp Memorial and Museum at Sachsenhausen, to drive the survivors into the Baltic Sea and drown them. Thousands died along the roadside. Soviet troops liberated approximately 3,000 survivors who had been left behind too weak to walk. At the all-female concentration camp at Ravensbrück, 50 kilometers north of Berlin, the SS murdered the last surviving women in the gas chamber that had been hastily improvised in January 1945. Catholic political prisoner Carmela Flöck, an Austrian survivor who lived to be liberated, later recorded one of the rare moments of human gentleness in those weeks. 2 or 3 weeks after the liberation, a Russian general came to our sickbay. He made a fine, educated, and intelligent impression, and I was enthused by his beautiful Russian. An interpreter translated. He said, among other things, he was pleased he could bring us news of freedom, and they will do everything to get us healthy and to help us forget the horrible time of fascism. We were moved to tears, and so was he. But the Red Army that liberated Ravensbrück also committed its own mass atrocities, on a scale that the Soviet Union and its Russian successor state would deny for half a century. Looting was universal. Soldiers shipped home wristwatches, sewing machines, radios, anything that could fit in a kit bag. Stalin himself, when complaints reached him from the Polish communist leadership, dismissed it as a trifle. The crime that has come to define the Soviet conquest of Berlin in the memory of its victims was rape. The scholarship is now substantial and grim. Antony Beevor's research, drawing on records of the Berlin Charité Hospital, Soviet medical reports, and the archives of the Soviet military administration, estimates that Red Army soldiers raped between 100,000 and 130,000 women in the city of Berlin between April and June 1945. Some women were raped repeatedly over days or weeks. As many as 10,000 are estimated to have died, many by suicide. Norman Naimark, in his Harvard-published study, The Russians in Germany, places the figure for the entire Soviet occupation zone at as many as 2 million. The victims were not only Germans. Forced laborers from Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, France, the Netherlands, even women liberated from German concentration camps, were also raped by their supposed liberators. An anonymous German woman, a journalist before the war, kept a diary through those weeks. It was published in West Germany in 1959 under the title A Woman in Berlin, and became one of the most important first-person documents of the entire campaign. Officially, it's called a shelter. We called it a cave, an underworld, a catacomb of fear, a mass grave. The official Soviet response was contradictory. An internal report by political commissar Vladimir Semenov, dated April 1945, and unearthed by historian Manfred Seidler, openly admitted, in spite of the order of the War Council regarding the change of behavior towards the Germans, there are still many cases of the rape of women. A handful of soldiers were court-martialed and shot. The vast majority were not. The motivations were many. Revenge for what German troops had done in the Soviet Union, group pressure, propaganda, collapsed discipline, alcohol, the dehumanization of the enemy after 4 years of total war. None excuse what happened. All help explain it. The historian Catherine Merridale, who interviewed hundreds of Red Army veterans, wrote that some men spoke of it openly, even decades later. Others wept. Many simply refused to speak. These crimes are not a footnote to the Battle of Berlin. For the women who lived through them, they were the battle. By April 25, 1945, the Red Army had completed the encirclement of Berlin. From that moment on, the city was a closed system. There were almost 2.5 million civilians inside it, perhaps 90,000 combat-capable German soldiers, and an army of 2.5 million Soviet and Polish troops working their way toward the center, block by block, cellar by cellar. The defense of the city was the work of General Helmuth Weidling, a competent professional artilleryman whom Hitler had ordered shot for cowardice on April 22nd, only to give him command of the entire Berlin garrison less than 24 hours later when the death sentence was rescinded. Weidling divided Berlin into 8 defensive sectors, labeled A through H, with the central government district designated Sector Z for Zentrum. The plan on paper was to defend the S-Bahn Ring, the elevated rail line that encircles central Berlin. In practice, the defense was held together by a few hundred fanatics. The best units left to him were foreign volunteers of the Waffen-SS, French, Dutch, Norwegian, Danish, Latvian, the men who had nothing to go home to and nowhere to run. The Volkssturm in many districts simply melted away. Police battalions changed into civilian clothes. The teenage Hitler youth, ordered to defend the bridges over the Spree with Panzerfausts, often fought to the death because no one had told them they were allowed to surrender. The Soviet assault on the city center used tactics refined 2.5 years earlier at Stalingrad by General Vasily Zhukov, now commanding the 8th Guards Army for the second time against the same enemy in a different city. Zhukov's storm groups consisted of perhaps 30 to 50 men, infantry, combat engineers with explosives, flamethrower teams, a small detachment of anti-tank gunners, and a 76mm or 122mm self-propelled gun. They fought their way forward room by room, breaking through cellar walls with charges, sending the SPGs to blow open building entrances at point-blank range. The Soviet interpreter Elena Zhevskaya, attached to General Zhukov's headquarters, recorded her first impressions of the dying city. It was a huge, unfamiliar city. The smoke of the fires obscured its outlines, and the blocks of ruined buildings gave the city an eerie appearance. Almost 6 years ago, a criminal invasion of Europe, unprecedented in cruelty, began from here. The war has returned. For the civilians, the experience was not metaphor, it was hell. The largest air raid shelters, the 3 concrete flak towers at the zoo, Humboldthain and Friedrichshain, each housed up to 30,000 people, in the final week of the battle. Conditions were unspeakable. There was little water, no sanitation, and no electricity. Children died of dehydration in the corridors. The wounded, dragged in from the streets above, lay in pools of their own blood on the concrete floors. The diarist Anonyma, whose journal was published as a woman in Berlin, wrote, "Officially, it's called a shelter. We called it a cave, an underworld, a catacomb of fear, a mass grave." On April 27th and 28th, the storm reached the Great Government District. Konev's forces, advancing from the south, ran into Zhukov's forces, advancing from the east. Several friendly fire incidents nearly turned into full-blown engagements between Soviet armies before Stalin, in Moscow, drew a final boundary line. Konev's troops were withdrawn from the city. The honor of taking the Reichstag and the casualties would belong to Zhukov. The Reichstag itself was, by 1945, almost a ruin. Burned in the propaganda fire of February 1933 and never properly restored, it had not been used as a parliament for 12 years. But to Soviet propaganda, it had a meaning beyond its bricks. It was the symbol of Germany. To plant the red banner of victory on its roof on May 1st, International Workers' Day, was a political demand that came directly from Stalin. The Third Shock Army, commanded by Colonel General Vasily Kuznetsov, was given the task. The Reichstag was defended by perhaps 1,500 men, a mixed force of Wehrmacht, SS, and some Volkssturm. The Soviets attacked across the Königsplatz on April 29th under massed artillery fire, suffering hundreds of dead before they reached the building's shattered steps. The fight then moved inside, into the corridors, the cellars, the smoke-filled debating chamber. It lasted 3 days. At 22:40 on April 30th, 1945, soldiers of the 150th Rifle Division managed to raise a red banner over the Reichstag roof. The famous photograph by Yevgeny Khalday, with its careful subsequent retouching to remove a wristwatch on one soldier's arm, almost certainly looted, would be taken 2 days later and staged for posterity. It would become, for 100 million Soviet citizens, the single iconic image of victory. 16 meters beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, in a complex of concrete rooms that smelled of damp cement, diesel fumes, and human sweat, Adolf Hitler spent his last hours alive. The Führerbunker was never designed to be a permanent residence. Built between 1943 and 1944 as an air raid shelter, it had become Hitler's home and headquarters since January 1945. By the last week of April, it contained perhaps 24 permanent residents: Hitler, Eva Braun, the Goebbels family, Martin Bormann, Generals Krebs and Burgdorf, the secretaries Junger and Christian, the chef Constanze Manciali, the SS adjutants, a handful of others. Above them, the city burned. On April 29th, at around 1 in the morning, Hitler married Eva Braun. The ceremony, conducted by a Berlin registrar named Walter Wagner, who had been brought to the bunker for the purpose, lasted 10 minutes. Wagner left immediately afterward and was reportedly killed by Soviet artillery fire on his way home. The marriage certificate was preserved and is now held by the Bundesarchiv. That same day, Hitler dictated his political testament. He blamed the Jews for the war. He blamed his generals for the defeat. He named Admiral Karl Dönitz, his successor, as Reich president, a final insult to Hermann Göring, who had inquired by telegram from Bavaria 3 days earlier whether he might assume leadership. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party, having been informed of Himmler's secret negotiations with Sweden's Count Folke Bernadotte to surrender the Western Front. Joseph Goebbels was named Reich Chancellor. On April 30th at around 15:30, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his study. Hitler shot himself in the right temple with his 7.65mm Walter PPK pistol. Braun died from cyanide. Their bodies were carried up the bunker steps into the Chancellery Garden by Otto Günsche and Heinz Linger, doused with petrol and burned in a shell crater. Soviet forensic teams of Smersh counterintelligence, led by an officer named Vasily Gorbushin, recovered partial remains a few days later. The historical record on this point is now closed. The conspiracy theory that Hitler escaped to Argentina is exactly that, a theory with no evidence. The day after Hitler's death, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda murdered their 6 children with cyanide capsules administered while the children slept. They then walked up into the garden and were shot by an SS officer at their own request. The German political journalist Margaret Bovary, hearing the news in her flat across the city, wrote in her diary, "I'm curious to know how it really was. Few people seem to realize that this man deliberately destroyed as much as he could. Believing in victory, they believed he believed too. He did not." On the night of May 1st to 2nd, the remaining bunker inhabitants attempted to break out. They split into several small groups and tried to escape north through the U-Bahn tunnels and across the Weidendammer Bridge. Most were killed. Martin Bormann, last seen near Lehrter Bahnhof, would later be confirmed dead by DNA testing of remains discovered in 1972. The secretary Traudl Junge, 25 years old, broken but alive, managed to slip out of the city and would live until 2002, eventually writing the memoir Until the Final Hour that became the basis for the film Downfall. At dawn on May 2nd, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, walked out of his command post on Bendlerstrasse, crossed the Soviet lines, and offered the unconditional surrender of the city and its garrison to General Zhukov. He signed the surrender document at 6 o'clock. By 6 in the evening, almost all firing in central Berlin had stopped. The Battle of Berlin was over. The cost is staggering even by the arithmetic of the Eastern Front. Soviet casualty returns, held at Samo and analyzed by Russian historian Grigory Krivoshev, lists 78,291 Red Army and Polish dead and missing during the Berlin operation, with another 274,184 wounded. German military losses are harder to pin down. Estimates by Earl Ziemke and Christopher Duffy place them at between 100,000 and 130,000 dead. Civilian losses in the city are believed to lie between 22,000 and 100,000. On May 8th, in a small schoolhouse in the Berlin suburb of Karlshorst, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces in the presence of Marshal Zhukov, Air Chief Marshal Tedder, General Spaatz, and General de Lattre de Tassigny. The war in Europe was over. For the Soviet Union, the fall of Berlin was the culmination of the Great Patriotic War, the final, blood-soaked vindication of the sacrifice of 27 million dead. For the survivors of the camps, the freed forced laborers, the prisoners of war who had spent 4 years in barbed wire, it was the end of a nightmare. For the German civilians of the city, it was the start of 45 years of military occupation that would only end with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The Soviet Union erected 3 great war memorials in Berlin, in Tiergarten, Treptow, and Schönholzer Heide. They still stand today. Beneath them lie the bones of more than 20,000 Red Army soldiers who died in the final battle of the largest war the world has ever known. The lair of the beast had fallen. The reckoning had only just begun.